Okay, today we're going to end off chapter 19 with section 3, which is about how Japan returned to a state of isolationism. And we're going to look at feudalism sort of taking control of Japan during this time under strong local leaders. In 1467, a civil war destroyed the old feudal system in Japan. And from 1467 to 1568, it was a time known as the Warring States. So you have war between feudal lords against other manors and areas of control as well. What emerged out of this were daimyo. Daimyo were warrior chieftains that are the lords of the new feudal system. The emperor was kind of serving as a figurehead, but really didn't have much power. The daimyos were really building their own personal armies of mounted samurai and also gun-bearing infantrymen. So firearms started to change the way that Japan fought during this time span as well. New leaders emerged and began to restore order, though. One of the most famous daimyo that took control was Oda Nabunaga. He was a powerful daimyo who took control of the capital city of Kyoto in 1568. Nabunaga tried to eliminate rival daimyos and also Buddhist monasteries. In 1582, he committed suicide when an ally turned against him. And then a general of Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, carried on Nobunaga's work. By 1590, Hideyoshi had controlled most of Japan, and he launched an invasion of Korea, which was controlled by the Chinese at this time, but the effort ended there when he died. Then what we have is a shogunate, a group of shoguns called the Tokugawa Shogunate that united Japan. They were led by Tokugawa Ieyasu. He took over and completed the unification process in Japan. In 1603, he became known as the shogun, or the sole ruler. He set up the capital city at Edo, which grew to becoming the modern-day city of Tokyo. He uses a lot of restrictions to keep some of the local lords or daimyo under control. And the Tokugawa Shogunate ruled Japan from 1603 to 1867, so a fairly successful ruling body. Talk a little bit about life in Tokugawa Japan, but first I'd like to show you a map. This is Japan. Okay, there are some other islands here, Hokkaido. But when you're talking about Honshu, and you see Tokyo is located right here, these are the areas that were controlled in the 1700s by the Tokugawa Shogunate, and then eventually all these other individual boundaries that were controlled by daimyo were unified underneath the shogunate. This is an example of a castle in Japan, how that would look. It's got a little defense wall here, and then you have typical Japanese architecture there. Okay, so we had a long period of peace, prosperity, and cultural growth under Tokugawa. We had a very structured society with the shogun as the actual leader, not a figurehead, but an actual leader. They utilized Chinese Confucian ideas to influence society, and peasants would have to pay very high taxes. Many would leave their farms and would join cities for more manufacturing jobs and things of that nature by the 1700s. Now, by the middle of the 1700s, Japan was becoming a more urban society due to the manufacturing process and the spread of industrial ideas coming from Europe. Most women, though, also led very sheltered lives, very domestic. Culture under the Tokugawa Shogunate, they had very traditional cultural practices. They had the no dramas, which were popular among samurai, wealthy folks. Townspeople enjoyed new type of realistic fiction. Many people enjoyed the haiku, the three-line poetry that presents images as well. And then Kabuki Theater with skits and elaborate costumes, music, and dance became very popular. This is sort of what Kabuki Theater looks like today in Japan. Here's a depiction of what it may have looked like back in the time period in which it was being used, which would be 1700s and 1800s. Also, during this time, you have contact between Europe and Japan. Portugal began to send trading ships, merchants, and also technology to Japan for purposes of trade. In the 1540s, European traders actually began to arrive, and they were actually welcomed at that time by the Japanese, but eventually European firearms were introduced, which really changed the way that the Japanese fought. A good example, a sort of decent example of this is the Tom Cruise film, The Last Samurai, which kind of depicts a little bit of the firearms and how they changed the warring ways of the samurai. You also have Christianity starting to spread into Japan. In 1549, the first Christian missionaries arrived. They were mostly Portuguese by that time. By 1600, though, about 300,000 Japanese were Christians. Japan's rulers actually eventually became upset by this, and they banned Christianity. After there was a 1637 rebellion, Christianity was forbidden in Japan, and they enforced an adherence to some form of Buddhism instead of any religious freedom. So it was very much an oppression against Christians, and any Christian missionaries were oftentimes tortured or killed. Next is Roman numeral 4, the closed country policy. So Japan eventually, due to some of the lack of acceptance of European intervention, they became isolated. And the first Europeans, when they came to Japan, there really was no central authority in Japan. Shoguns, as we learned, like Tokugawa, who later took power, they did not like European ways of life. And so the shoguns would limit European trade to one port, which was the port of Nagasaki, and only the Dutch and the Chinese were allowed to trade. Shoguns would basically control what was going on with the trade. So during this time, Japanese people were forbidden to travel abroad, and this is what isolation is in a nutshell. They basically developed this isolationistic ideology. They did not allow foreign trade to a very great extent, and most of their people were also not allowed to travel outside of Japan.